This is a basic demonstration on how to mount a scope guard to your rifle. For a deer rifle, where the scope rings usually mount, there will be a set of holes where they mount onto. In this case, we're going to be putting a pick rail on top and mount that instead. A lot of the modern rifles now will be coming with pick rails, and for guns such as the AR-15, a lot of the uppers already come with pick rails built into them and won't need to be added. The first step of mounting the scope guard is having a pick rail. If your gun does not have a pick rail already mounted to it, you will be able to find one that matches the model of your rifle. There will be a set of holes on top where the rings usually mount, where the rail should line up exactly with those holes. So the first thing we're going to do is mount the pick rail to the rifle. As you do this, you want to just barely snug them down to keep everything in line, and then tighten them at the end. Once everything's in line and snug down, you want to use the short end of the Allen wrench and the long end to get the leverage to be able to tighten it down all the way. Do this evenly across all of them without stripping them, but make sure that they're snug enough that the rail does not move around. Now, the second thing that you're going to want to do is put your scope rings onto your scope and move them towards the center of the scope, allowing for the space for the scope guard to be mounted around it. The reason for having them closer is so that the outer rings where the scope guard mounts to will have less leverage and be able to take more impact. So you're going to want to put your scope onto the pick rail, and there are a lot of different notches to decide at what distance you want to have the scope from your eye. Once you have a comfortable spot of where it's going to sit on the rail, you remember at what notch that you have it at. From there, you want to mount regular scope rings that would usually hold another scope onto the rifle, one notch down in the back and one notch forward in the front from the position that you chose to have your scope mounted at. While leaving all of these loose to allow for the play and movement of mounting it, you then set your scope into the spot that you want. As you can see, there are two separate rings. The rings that hold the scope to the pick rail, and then the rings that hold the guard that surrounds the scope. Now, you want to make sure that when you have these rings on there, that they are the right distance, that it lines up with the holes that are pre-drilled to the scope guard. From that point, once you know that everything is in line, you just barely snug down first the rings that hold your scope on. Oops, that's the wrong end. And keep them pushed towards the center of the scope. A pick rail has a little bit of movement left to right, so that they can be spaced out. Once you have that just snug down to where you have it comfortable, then you still leave these two outer scope ring mounts loose. while you're putting the scope guard on. That makes it easier to align the holes for the screws that would usually be used to mount the top ring to the scope mount that we're going to use to bolt down the scope guard. Use the holes that are pre-cut in the top of the scope guard to put the Allen wrench through to be able to thread the screws on. Again, with this, you're just getting it started with the thread. You're not trying to tighten it down all the way. You're going to leave everything loose. You're just doing this to get the holes in line. If you have trouble attaching the screw to the Allen wrench, it helps to put a magnet on the Allen wrench to magnetize the wrench to hold the screw to be able to line it up with the hole. Once you have those snugged down, you want to make sure that the second set of rings that hold the guard are separated from the rings that hold the scope, so that if an impact is taken by the scope guard, they don't bump into the rings that hold your scope and knock your scope out of zero. Once the rings are pushed away so that there is a gap, then you snug down the screws that hold the scope guard's rings on. Now that everything is snug, you want to check and make sure that everything aligns right, that you have a gap between the two rings so that it can take an impact without knocking it out of zero. And secondly, that the back of the scope aligns with the back of the scope guard. I like to keep the scope guard mounted just a little bit farther in front of the scope so that if it kicks back and the scope was to hit your eye, that it is your eye that hits the scope and not the guard. You can make minor adjustments by loosening the top of the scope mount rings that hold your scope and slide your scope forward and backwards for getting it just right with where you're comfortable having it with your eye. Once you have all of this tightened in, then you tighten down everything as tight as you can from the top without stripping it. You also want to make sure that all of the scope rings are tightened all the way so that they don't rattle loose at any point, throwing your scope off. For this, you should be using the short end of the Allen wrench so that you can get enough torque on it to really tighten down the screw. The same goes for tightening the scope guard to the top rings. If you couldn't get it tight enough from the top, you can go in from the side, lock it in, and still get that leverage to really crank the screw all the way tight on all 4 screws. That is pretty much the entire mount of how to mount a scope guard to a rifle if it doesn't have a pick rail.